Critical media literacy is extremely important, and not just media literacy in the way that, institutions that are government sponsored or NGOs that are co-opted express, because that is usually goes along with, you know, fact-checking institutions or organizations that are administered by think tanks like the Atlantic Council telling us what is and what is not a Russian bot or disinformation. No, I'm talking about critical media literacy. This is media literacy that should be widespread and across all of our education. Because what it means is that you, as a media consumer, are understanding where this information is being filtered from and through, and who is administering it, and what their biases and invested interests are. And that's what's so crucial and I think missing from a lot of the dialogue about media literacy today is that critical lens that we need. Where is this information coming from? And who's telling it? And why?
It's absolutely crucial that we have critical media literacy in this world because the media is one of the most powerful tools and forces in our society, and it shapes the way we understand everything. And unfortunately, there is so little media literacy out there right now. An example of this is a Stanford University study, which showed that only a quarter of students studied recognized and explained the significance of a blue check mark on social media. And over 30% of students argued that a fake account was more trustworthy because of some key graphical elements that they included in the study. Moreover, more than 80% of these students believed that native advertisements identified by the word sponsored content underneath was a real news story. So that suggests that even digital natives have an absolutely perilous task online trying to differentiate fact and fiction and what is truthful, honest reporting and what is editorials, advertorials, and deceitful sponsored content. We really are, especially now we are all living our lives online in this massive new world full of powerful forces that people just don't understand according to the surveys and the polls. And that's why we really have a huge need for critical media literacy right now. So people can be in their own driver's seats, deciding how and where they get information and deciding whom they can trust and who they cannot trust. And that's the reason I think it's so important that we have to teach people how to think critically rather than what to think. What I mean by that is we need to teach them how to analyze sources and give them a lot of options on where to look so that they have a very broad understanding of what's out there. We want to broaden people's media habits, not constrict them. And media trust across the West, but particularly in the United States, has been falling for decades. In the United States, it's been steadily falling since the 1970s, to the point where only 32% of the population now says that they have a great deal or even a fair amount of confidence that the media reports the news in full and in a fair and accurate way. So we're really at an all-time nadir in terms of trust in the media. That is really where we are. We're in a crisis point, and critical media literacy can be a way out of that.
I would say it is important to have critical media literacy education with that emphasis on the critical, in part because we are surrounded by media. We, in many ways, live our lives through the media. It is how we learn about the world around us. It is how we're entertained. It is how we share information with people. But we are not just surrounded by media content. All of that content that comes to us and all of it that seems to come to us so easily these days by tiny devices that fit in our pockets all have owners and producers, and they need to be distributed. And part of the critical media literacy is making sure that we are looking behind the scenes at that process of ownership, production, and distribution. To just focus on media content leaves out a significant portion of the story, a significant portion not just of what we are seeing, reading, and listening to, but how it got to us in the first place. I think in critical media literacy, the absence of data is data. And so part of what we also do is explore what might not be getting to us, right? What aren't we learning about? What are we being in some capacity restricted from? So the critical invites us to interrogate, to ask questions, and to look behind the scenes.
Critical media literacy education is vital because we have to think about news in terms of both supply and demand. And without a demand for high quality news that serves the public interest, there's no motivation for most of the quote mainstream corporate news outlets to provide that. And so I think critical media literacy provides people with the tools they need to be, if we're going to use that consumer model, to be shrewd, informed consumers.
We need media literacy because media are so influential in shaping how we come to see and understand the world. And I think we need specifically critical media literacy because I think the word critical gets to the heart of what's most important about understanding the media environment. A lot of people mistake the word critical to mean just being negative. I've actually had people talk to me about media bashing, and I always try to explain to them, no, it's critical in terms of critical thinking, which means deep investigation and not just being satisfied with what's on the surface. But critical, when it comes to critical media literacy, also attaches itself to a long tradition coming out of critical theory. And for me, that tradition has been starting with Marxism and moving into the things that Antonio Gramsci introduced into the conversation about hegemony and the construction of ideology and things that are actually very unnatural becoming accepted as natural, as just common sense. And then moving into the work of Stuart Hall and others in cultural studies, which played a really important role in explaining how we shouldn't take popular culture for granted. It's not just entertainment, that it plays a real role in shaping our understandings of things like race and class and gender and sexuality, and how all of that plays out in terms of hierarchies, of inequities. And so for me, critical media literacy is really, at the end of the day, always about power. And who has the power in society, who has the power to tell the stories, to shape our understanding of the world. And from there, that actually translates into material power, and that's, so I'm coming from, that cultural studies perspective, that ideological power. Eventually, it's not just about what we think, it's about how we live, it's about distribution of resources, and so critical media literacy it really is a radical tradition, radical, from the original meaning of radical, getting to the roots of what's really happening in our society and the crucial role that media play in maybe not completely determining everything, but in shaping how we come to understand what's going on in politics, what's going on in the economy, what's going on in social upheaval.
I think that critical media literacy education is a really vital component of this work and also just of education generally. I work in my day job as a preschool teacher, and so I am most of the time teaching children how to read, but more generally teaching children how to kind of take in the world around them. And that's like a really vital skill that a lot of people in the world lack, and how to take in the world critically and not just take everything for granted, not taking these like kind of destructive mainstream narratives for granted. It's a really important part of teaching, and especially in early education, these are skills that nobody's really focusing on at this point, but that ground children for the rest of their lives and will decide how they interpret the news and how they interpret the world around them. And so being able to kind of read between the lines and understand what perspective is being taken, but also what perspectives are being left out, are a really vital part of education that's just not, it's not even being focused on right now, whether it's on the pre-K level that I teach or whether it's high school or college. These are not skills that are easily accessible, but they should be.
First of all, we live in a highly mediated world. Everyone, I mean, you know, we're in a time now where a lot of people are just looking at screens from the time they wake up to the time they go to bed, right? And that's just one form of media, way that our lives are mediated. So you need to, first of all, at a basic level, I think, just understand that our lives are being mediated, that we're being pushed and nudged in different directions, both in terms of like how we think about the world, how we think about fundamental things like our happiness, what makes us happy, what we want to be, what we want to do, but also about political things like who's in power, how we arrive in the kind of situations we're in. And I think that you have to be literate with the media to understand those questions. Another way to answer this is to say that we're also living through a time of crisis. We're not the first group of people to live through times of crisis, but we're dealing with crisis of what's called climate change. We're dealing with crisis of, you know, racism, sexism, ableism, you know, all these kinds of things. And I think that critical media literacy can help you understand what those things have to do with the mediated world we live in. Whereas without understanding that, you kind of are at the mercy of those technologies.
It's really essential, and it's amazing how many times students in my classes propose this as a response to the problems that we talk about in class. It's quite clear, if you spend any time at all talking about the problem of, for instance, fake news, or problems of privacy online, all kinds of other problems, that if people don't know very much about how the systems they are using work, they end up not using the systems but being used by them. And you can't defend yourself unless you have a critical media literacy. You can't participate in a democracy. You can't actually take advantage of the potentials represented by the technologies unless you have a fairly sophisticated understanding of how the technologies work and what they're all about.
First thing I'd like to say is that we live in a mediated universe now, especially since COVID. Most of us around the world, not just the United States, are living 24/7 with screens. I mean, we're on a screen now. This is really especially targeting our students who spend much of their lifetime there. And it's really, really important for us to understand not just the technology and the software, but actually who owns them, who operates them, how power directs our life online, and what we can do about it. And media literacy is now being touted by a lot of administrators, including mine. But my worries is that it's really just functional literacy, how people can learn how to use more and more new software. And instead not understanding the larger world in which we operate and the powers that are controlling our lives.
I say this as somebody who got into media literacy not through academia, but through starting my own journalism journey and starting to pick apart the propagandization that is fed to us via corporate media and finding a home away from that, both as a journalist and someone who consumes media in the alternative and independent press areas. So the importance of critical media literacy education is that it is the lens through which we see everything. And I think some people might feel, oh, well, it's just, media literacy. It's like, okay, whatever. It's not that big of an issue. The world's on fire. Right. But the world is on fire. But our media, as in the corporate media, legacy media, also known as, isn't saying that. But if we know that the world is on fire, A, we're obviously getting that information from somewhere. And B, why aren't the largest media entities in our world, and of course in our country, talking about it in that way? So this is the importance of that critical media literacy education. Whatever your issue is, the climate, workers' rights, feminist issues, racial justice, whatever your primary issue is, critical media literacy has to be at least in the top 5, because it is the lens through which you are able to access the information about the issues that are most important to you. And so if we don't have media literacy, then we don't have the ability to pick apart the propagandization that happens with regards to the issues that we care most about.
Critical media literacy has a focus on political economy of media. It looks at not just the messages, or it doesn't just analyze the messages that we receive, but it analyzes who creates them, for what, and for what purposes, why certain messages are there, and why some are missing. Critical media literacy introduces us to topics such as ownership and how that affects content, editors and how they affect content, public relations and how that affects content. For instance, probably a few people know that the corporate media is owned by a handful of people and a handful of media conglomerates. Most people probably don't know that Bill Gates provided $319 million to already wealthy corporate media businesses to push his messages on education and healthcare reform. Most people don't know that police departments across the United States spend over $10 million every year on propaganda, public relations. Again, most people probably don't know that the heads of these corporate media conglomerates sit on the boards and are on the same boards as people from the weapons industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the oil industry. They all have these vested class interests, and they use the corporate media to push these. So in my view, that's one of the main reasons why critical media literacy is so important, because you got to go behind to see the machine, the system that creates those messages, not just analyzing those messages.
It's, one of the most important factors that is facing us today, because ultimately knowledge is power, as they say, and the media is the main purveyor of knowledge, for better or for worse. And especially these days with the internet, it can be like drinking from a fire hose. So, what to understand about every individual outlet, how to read between the lines, how to be able to look at how multiple outlets are covering multiple different stories, knowing what kind of background you need to actually be able to look at any particular story in the right light is critically important if we want to make civic change in society, social change in society. If you're saying you want things to go from worse to better, you have to know how to act, which means you need to know how to use information. And so I think critical media literacy is essential. It's maybe the precondition for us being able to actually make any significant change in our society. And if we're talking about a democracy, small d democracy, let's say it in that way, I think we can't live without it, because if we don't know how to look at information and evaluate it, how can we determine what to do and what can really actually make our lives better?
Critical media literacy is essential for being a thinking citizen who engages in the world. And by that, I mean every aspect of our life is shaped by media. We can't live outside of media. We are bombarded constantly by media messages. And so in order to be able to navigate our way in the world, we need to think critically about those messages. We need to be able to deconstruct who is creating them, why they're creating them, and how they're impacting us. And then also what we want to do in response to those messages, not just as individuals, but as a group of united citizens addressing structural issues that come into play. One of the things that I think is important about critical media is that it also is connected to critical pedagogy. And this theoretical tradition wants us to engage in the world as citizens. They want us to engage in making real change or media activism. And that's what separates media literacy from critical media literacy. Regular media literacy treats us as consumers and wants us to know what product to buy, what's better for us, or what is more truthful. And that's a fine starting point. But critical media literacy has us thinking about issues of power, and then doesn't stop there. It has us go one step further to think about how we can address issues of inequality, not just for us as individuals, but for the entire society.
The United States doesn't have a media literacy educational curricular program. It's not part of Common Core. If it's sprinkled in, it's because of a particular instructor or a teacher that does it. So there are other places in the world, other countries in the world, in Europe and throughout parts of Asia that have had media literacy in their curriculum for a long time. And there's a big difference between acritical and critical media literacy. Acritical media literacy can also be seen as corporate media literacy because it's often sponsored by major tech firms, Silicon Valley companies, even organizations like the NATO now sponsor their own media literacy programs. Under the guise of fighting disinformation or misinformation. And of course, that's where this call for media literacy came from after the 2016 election. But critical media literacy is different. It interrogates systems of power. It looks behind messages and who's crafting messages. Media literacy itself, that isn't critical or that is acritical, tends to bolster status quo messaging. It's really just a form of pro-establishment propaganda in many ways. Some of the more prominent media literacy organizations that are acritical in the United States, they don't promote critical thought. They promote products, or they promote people plugging into certain preordained ideas. Other examples of this are, say, NewsGuard, which is basically an tech org that is just filled with former, CIA people, psychological operations people, military-industrial complex people. And they try to rate news sites on the basis of whether they're credible or not credible. But of course, everything that's credible is establishment. Whether it's Fox, CNN, The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, somehow they're all green-lighted. While anything alternative, no matter how factual they might publish information, like Mint Press News, Consortium News, they're red flagged by NewsGuard. And of course, some of those other organizations are also now deplatformed and demonetized. Back to critical media literacy. Critical media literacy teaches people how to understand the shortcomings of regular or acritical media literacy, but it also does something much more important. It calls attention to the corporate power structure of media and information dissemination, and how there's really no firewall between the handful of corporations, the 90% owned by about 6 corporations in the United States for the so-called mainstream or establishment press. There's 5 major tech companies, referred to as FANG, coming out of Silicon Valley. So we have a really small, concentrated ownership of messaging and controlling of narratives. And critical media literacy goes behind that, right? It teaches students how to ask the right kind of questions that expose who's controlling messaging, that expose biases in any given media outlet. And it encourages people to really explore different alternative and independent forms of media, up to and including encouraging people to be the media and really report on things that are happening in their own lives and their own community.
Considering that media communication and education are our primary ways of obtaining information, of trading information, learning, and agreeing, whether consciously or unconsciously, to what is true, critical media literacy helps us to actually discern all of that, not just to formulate personal opinion, but to actually be able to hold public discourse, to hold private discourse, whether in the public sphere or online, and to ask key questions, to look beneath the surface.
Critical media literacy is important, but first we need to be able to define it, which is the ability to critically analyze, evaluate, and interpret the information presented in news media. And it really involves people like understanding how news is produced and identifying bias and misinformation and being able to distinguish between fact and opinion. And this is a really important skill that people in any society need to have, because especially in a democracy, the United States is a democracy, and we uphold our First Amendment rights and we uphold free speech. The power has to be in our hands to distinguish fact from fiction, especially when we live in a world where today less than 6 corporations control over 90% of what we see, hear, and read. And so we have to re-empower ourselves with these kinds of skills to be able to interpret what is information that works in the interest of the political establishment and elite, and what is information that is being used to manipulate and manufacture consent for certain policies or wars. Unfortunately, the very entities that the media and we the people are supposed to hold accountable, the very 1% political elite, the military class, the architects of wars, the very institutions that work to privatize certain institutions and industries, those are the ones who are now leading the charge to build the infrastructure to promote critical media literacy, but it's critical media literacy that works in their interests. And they do this under the guise of, of saying that we need to fight misinformation and fake news and Russian propaganda, when in reality, it's these very institutions and organizations and people that brought us, the Cold War with Russia. These are the same institutions that brought us the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we look at the launch of NewsGuard, for example. NewsGuard is a news rating system that is founded by the very architects of the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan. And of course, they're giving every single corporate media outlet that led us into these wars that were based on lies, like the New York Times, MSNBC, and CNN and Washington Post. They're giving those news organizations big green check marks, and they are rating them on the system that shows that they are providing factual information, it's non-biased, et cetera, and that they're transparent in their funding, most of which this information is not even true. And then they target independent media outlets like Mint Press, like Consortium News, and they give us these big red X check marks and say that we are suspicious. And why are we suspicious? Because we hold these same news organizations and these same institutions and think tanks that are funded by war accountable. And so we are living in an intellectual no-fly zone right now. We are living in an information war, and that's why it's important for the mass population to have these critical media literacy skills so that they can differentiate what is propaganda.
I think at some level, this is something we decided almost centuries ago. People thought it was absurd to have a democracy where people couldn't read. And I think if you apply that today to the 21st century, it's absurd that we have people consuming so much media, but without an education system teaching them how to be literate within it. And so I think it's not really that radical or new of an idea, just the diversity and amount of media have changed. Some studies show folks consuming somewhere between 10 and 16 hours of media a day. Given the average person sleeps between 6 and 8, that basically means while you're awake, you're using media, which means media has a huge influence on how we see the world, our perceptions, and how we participate in that world as well. And so anybody who cares about democracy or human autonomy must equip the citizenry with the skills to be able to navigate this heavily mediated environment. The reason why the critical angle is so important is that there's a lot of people who will echo my same desire to see media literacy, but they're more interested in teaching people how to use and become dependent upon digital tools, where I'm more interested in teaching them how to investigate the power dynamics of these tools so they can use them as a more responsible citizen. And in the US, that's the difference between the so-called critical and acritical folks. The acritical folks, they usually walk or echo the corporate line. They think it's exciting that young people can open up social media accounts or can participate, in the AI revolution. Those of us in the critical camp, we still think there's something important for using these tools. It's okay to get pleasure from these tools and like these tools, but we're really doing a disservice to users when they're not aware of the power dynamics behind these tools. So to give a quick example, an acritical framework would say that users are empowered because they're on social media, creating things and sharing their ideas. A critical perspective might say, no, actually, I think social media users are largely exploited. They're doing free and unpaid labor. They're giving up their privacy in the process. They have the delusion of power when in fact the power lies in the platform creator who controls the algorithm. So that's kind of an example of the substantive differences between the critical and acritical approach.
We need critical media literacy education because without it, there's really no way to sort of foster a better media landscape. And at the core of critical media literacy is this sort of examination of power and influence of media ownership within media production. And by dissecting how these influences may affect the dissemination of news, it really sort of provides a lot of insight into media bias. And I'm not really someone who is opposed to bias in my media. Everyone has bias. But the problem with corporate media is that they disguise themselves as this sort of unbiased authority, which is in no way true. I mean, you can't really have complete financial backing from mega corporations and remain unbiased. It's just not possible. So I think critical media literacy education is crucial in terms of empowering consumers, because without it, you're really only seeing part of the narrative. And if we don't know that there are problems with our media, then how can we ever work to improve it?
Critical media literacy, I think I mean, it should be taught as a fundamental part of education anyway, because it is all about learning how to ask questions, learning about why it's important to be skeptical, connecting the dots, as we say in journalism, following the money, figuring out who benefits from certain policy decisions, and who is left on the sidelines. And I think a large reason why we are not taught critical media literacy at very young ages is to, like what Chomsky talks about, manufacturing consent for the system that we live in, manufacturing consent for the lack of robust, educational systems, manufacturing consent for endless wars and occupation while we don't have healthcare in this country, or childcare, or elder care in this country, to differentiate between what we know is true, and how we are fed information that benefits not us, but the 1%, or the ruling class, the centers of power, is really important to build movements as well, to build movements, to build community, to be in a constant and evolving state of mutual aid. And I think with media literacy education, hopefully the next generation can start to dismantle these systems that uphold the worst of humanity.
Corporate media literacy, and of which there's becoming quite a lot of it, does a basic understanding, letting young people know, for example, the persuasions behind advertising. You buy that lipstick, you're not going to look like the model. If you buy the trainers, you're not going to suddenly grow taller and be able to put the ball in the hoop. But to my way of thinking, that's a very individual and almost superficial type of media literacy. It's all about consumption. It positions the student as only a consumer and not as a citizen in a society able to affect the conditions of their lives. So critical media literacy serves a purpose of empowering youth and telling them and working with them to create alternative narratives and engage in media in a very different way.
So many of the things we call media these days are actually increasingly things that take little bits from us. So critical media literacy now is about much more than having a critical take and understanding on the information you're receiving so that you can discern what is trustworthy or not trustworthy, or the actionable or non-actionable. Now it's about understanding what you're consuming, using, doing, and how that could actually affect you materially in your daily life. Like, some choice you made to go to one particular location over another, have that data correlated with something else, might that relate to you not being able to get a favorable mortgage, in 15 years? So critical media literacy is actually it is still about discerning, is a source trustworthy, is it misinformation? What is misinformation? Can the notion of misinformation be weaponized to, in fact, to push you in a direction that is favorable? And if you're trying to be sold a war, right? Don't believe this, it's misinformation, it comes from over here. Having a critical apparatus to determine what you should be basing your opinions on. But now it's even understanding when and where you're interacting with these systems, understanding how these broader systems are in turn creating ways in which you are being measured, and this sort of separate data double that marketers like to talk about which decisions are being made. And the decision isn't being made as a result of considering you, it's about these little bits that have been pulled out about you. And that's what people are basing there, and organizations and governments are going to start making decisions about you, about having this kind of holistic understanding of your relationship to those emerging systems is what critical media pedagogy to me.
Critical media literacy, I think, is an important and empowering tool to have for many reasons. And I think a lot of media users intuitively understand what the basic framework is and what it can do for them. We all feel unsatisfied with things we've read or watched in the news, but it can be sometimes hard to figure out what to do with all that, where to start, what questions to ask in order to sort of reach something that's maybe more useful in the long term. And that, starts with examining, the power dynamics in the media, who's allowed to create the messages we're receiving, and what are those messages and what emotions or values are they appealing to, what's being excluded and why, and so on. And a perfect example of this, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of in these interviews, is Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, which is ridiculous for a million reasons. But, Bezos can say all he wants, that he's not interested in micromanaging the editorial staff at the Post, but we know the conflicts of interest that can affect journalists' ability to look critically and say the labor practices at Amazon. They cover it, but what are they missing? What are they, deliberately censoring? Where can we look for more information? And independent media is a big palate cleanser in that way. And when you start to make comparisons, it can transform the way that you consume media and makes you more responsible in the way that you share things. And truthfully, I think as helpful as that is, I think it's also scary for a lot of people to confront, uncritically consuming media for maybe as long as they have. It was for me. I took a class in college and I was like, I can't believe it took me this long to think about things this way. I was a little bit embarrassed, but it was really valuable lesson, and it's made me, a stronger thinker, a better writer, researcher. And it's made me a more active participant, rather than just passively taking it all in like I was used to.
First of all, we live in a society that is completely saturated with media. What we do, there was a
media sociologist by the name of Todd Gitlin, who wrote a book called Media Unlimited about a decade ago, where he argued that basically what we do as a society is consume media. From the minute that we wake up in the morning to the minute we go to sleep, we wake up to clock radios, we get on our phones and we scroll through social media, we may watch the news over breakfast, and then we're listening to the radio in the car, and then we're on our computers at work, and then at night we go to a movie or we play video games or we interact with people on social media. We consume media constantly. It is omnipresent, and yet we don't often reflect on the role of media in our lives and whose interest media and media industries are designed to serve, right? And they're generally designed to serve a handful of elite interests. Most of our media are for-profit. Most of them are advertising supported. And so, to understand how this omnipresent force in our lives operates is really important for everyone. The secondary reason is that we're all citizens in a nominal democracy. And as citizens, right, it's incumbent on us to be informed about public issues, to be informed about not just about the candidates we vote for, because that's a very impoverished notion of democracy, that democracy is simply about voting. We need to know about the issues facing us as a society, issues of war and peace, environmental sustainability, gender-based violence, etc. And our corporate media do a very poor job, generally, of informing us about those issues. They obsess about the kind of the horse race between candidates from the two major parties. Who's ahead, who's behind? We constantly get reports about the polls, but they very rarely tell us about the issues at stake in elections or the issues at stake in public debates in our society. So I think those are the two real reasons that critical media literacy is just vital, right? Because we depend on the media, right, for information on those issues that concern us all as citizens, and because we as a society are saturated with media.
So I think it's crucially important for us to begin at a very young age incorporating in our educational curricula an emphasis on critical media literacy. And I think that emphasis on the first word, critical, is so important for at least two reasons. One is that it encourages us, not just as consumers of news, but also as engaged citizens in a democratic society, to approach news skeptically, to expect that there are patterns of emphasis and selection and omission in all news stories, that news stories are typically framed in particular ways. And so it's very important to cultivate that critical consumption of news media. But the second reason, I think, is that critical presupposes that a better system is possible. It assumes that the current system we have is suboptimal for democracy in many ways. And so we're already beginning to imagine a different kind of media system when we approach our current system in a critical fashion.
Critical media literacy is important, especially for citizens in a democracy. It's like supply of water or supply for food, because for making informed decisions at the ballot box, people need to be informed. So it's important that they distinguish what is quality information and what is non-reliable information. So that's why media literacy is very important in a democracy, and the earlier you start teaching that, the better.
So as a doctoral student, I lead the political economy of media class for undergrad students, and when you teach political economy of media, you cannot teach it without criticizing capitalism and big conglomerate media companies, media moguls. But a lot of times when we criticize these big corporations, we feel helpless, hopeless, right? What can we do? It is this system we live in, right? So yeah, a lot of times whenever they feel like hopeless, helpless, and they question, what can we do? I bring up this long list of alternative media outlets on a website of some university's library, which is incredible. And here you are. We can do alternative media activities without engaging all these big media conglomerates activities. Of course, you can enjoy these commercialized media platforms, but also you can look into other platforms, alternatives. And to talk about these alternatives, you should really start with critical media literacy or media literacy at all, right? So, and these days, because we all use digital media, not necessarily the press, right? So I think media literacy for, I have two daughters, one is teenager and one is 9, and including my kids, teaching them media literacy is not all about how to protect your daughter from digital fraud, something like that, scam, email, spam. It's not media literacy actually, right? Media literacy is knowing why you are getting this news feed, why you're getting this Instagram feed, why you're getting this TikTok feed, right? So yeah, media literacy really enables my students, my kids, to know why they are getting this news and information and why they are not getting this news and information. And I think it's really, really important skill for their even future with in other contexts which are not related to media, because at the end of the day, they will work with all this information and skills to deal with information.